big shout out to James and an uncomfortable amount of peaches and Shaded Spriter for becoming new patrons this week. Heroes and legends, all of you. This week, I have a special request. It's fashionable to shit on New Year's resolutions on the internet, right? You see it every year, and I even used to participate in it, and I'm not super proud of that. We humans tend to be creatures of habit, and we look for patterns, and we enjoy rituals. So last year I said, fuck all of that noise, and I'm gonna make some New Year's resolutions. I didn't have anything specific, but I promised myself I was going to do more in 2018 that was just for me. And this led to me going to Star Trek conventions, eventually making a speech at one, and now developing friendships with some of the actors. It led me to roller derby, which I'd need an entire episode to describe the positive ways that changed my life. In my own life, I'm better off because I said at the beginning of the year that I had goals. I set out to find specifics and I attacked them. They were mine, for me, for personal enjoyment and fulfillment. So I'm going to be doing it again this year. And next week's episode is going to be me sharing what my goals are for 2019 while reflecting a bit on 2018. I'm just leaning into the ritual and the arbitrary divisions of time us humans have created. Here's where you come in. I want you to lean in with me. I'd love to hear from you about what your successes were in 2018. I want to hear what you wanted, what you were up against, and how you overcame it, or what stopped you from overcoming it. I want to know what your hopes and fears are for 2019, and I want to know how we as a community can love and support you into achieving what you want. So let's do it, okay? I'm going to give you a phone number to call me in just a second where you can leave me a voicemail. Tell me your name, tell me where you're from if you're comfortable with that. Tell me what you wanted in 2018, what you were up against, and how you overcame it or how you didn't. Then tell me what you want out of 2019. Here's the phone number. It's 513-878-0429. That's 513-878-0429. I'll repeat it again at the end of the show. Thanks, friends. Love you lots. A quick note before we begin that this week's episode is about homelessness and the discrimination and violence that often accompany it. Take care of yourselves, friends. My name is Callie Wright, and this is the Gaytheist Manifesto. So in my hometown, about this time of year, it's impossible to go to the grocery store without hearing this. I'm sure you know the sound. I'm sure you've seen the red kettle. Christmas is the busiest time of the year for Salvation Army's funding efforts. At least that's when they're the most visible. And their tagline is doing the most good. It's written in big, bold letters on the stands that hold up the red kettles. But does doing the most good mean doing it for everyone? They'll tell you it does, but the reality is more complicated. Every year, we hear stories about the Salvation Army and their history with queer and trans folks. And spoiler alert, they're not usually feel-good stories. And for this week, I've found a few people with stories of their own. Maddie's parents kicked them out of the house in 2014 for being trans.
And then somehow got an apartment without a job and without income of any kind. And then I had a promise of a job, but the job fell through. So I started needing to be able to pay my rent, which luckily it was public housing, and I was only getting charged $50 a month, and which is about how much everybody will pay for the charity. And I was going to the trustees, all those different places, and finally my case manager through that agency that helps homeless people in the area was like, well, you could try Salvation Army, and I'm like, I am wary.
Maddie was very aware of the stories surrounding the Salvation Army and their treatment of queer and trans folks. By 2014, Salvation Army had already been in the news for trying to get around non-discrimination laws, and famously for one of their Australian leaders saying that they did in fact believe that gays deserve death.
But it got to the point where I needed the money, I needed a place to stay, and so I told her, if we do this, we have to use my dead name.
Maddie didn't feel comfortable asking for help unless they went, at least temporarily, back in the closet. And their caseworker didn't get it.
I don't think she really understood like why I was going to do that in that context, because she'd only ever heard me say, don't say my dead name. So we got the appointment set up. The day came and she gave me a ride over there, and she was using my dead name, and it was bothering me. It was hurting me a lot, but you have to do what you have to do.
And then Maddie's caseworker slips up. And instead of using their dead name, she called them Maddie.
The person who was helping us, I guess, she instantly caught on to that, and she's like, "Who's Maddie?" And Katie, who was the case manager, she froze up. She didn't know what to say, and I had to like slip in there and be like, "Oh yeah, I guess it's somebody else. That she must have a client that's named that, but my name is." And I said my dead name. They were digging in like, what, like, why did she slip up? Why was this name given? And also kind of like continued asking, "Who's Maddie?" And while like she couldn't answer that, like if it had been an actual different client, so she just kind of stayed quiet and say, "I can't say."
So as a case manager, she obviously can't talk about other clients or give details about other clients while she's with Maddie, so she couldn't really say anything. And I had to wonder, are we sure this was because of this person's feelings about trans people? I mean, I might reasonably think that if there was a name discrepancy, the organization might be worried about fraud or something like that. And the answer is sure, it's possible that's what was happening, but there was already a pretty hostile environment created by Salvation Army's past with trans people. And so it's not exactly a stretch to think that might be what was happening here. Maddie told me the homeless organization they worked with was well known and well respected. The default would have been to trust that if this organization was working with a client, things were just on the up and up. A caseworker of this kind usually has a huge load, right? It'd be pretty easy, and I would think it would be the default thing to assume the caseworker just messed up and used another client's name by mistake. So in this case, it's not as simple as a person pointing their finger and saying, "You're trans, we have a problem with that." And Maddie thankfully did get the help they needed, but Maddie certainly felt like there was extra scrutiny because of their appearance and the person's suspicion they might be trans. And this creates an environment where trans folks are less likely to seek help. And this gives the organization plausible deniability, right? They're not turning people away. They're just making things difficult enough that people stop coming. And that seems to be a reoccurring theme.
Well, I was homeless on and off for like 7 years.
This is Delina.
So I would go to whatever services I could to try and, get, help either if it, even if it wasn't just getting back on my feet. Usually I was just looking for like a stick of deodorant, maybe some clothes because I didn't have any, or mine got soaked and now they smell like mold, like just normal stuff when you're in that situation. So that's how I ended up going to Salvation Army. Is like, well, they say they're supposed to help the homeless, so here I go, right? Like, I was apprehensive at first because, I'd hang out with other homeless kids, right? And when I mentioned going, I'm like, well, what about the Salvation Army? I heard, they say they can, provide clothing and, help you with food and stuff like that. And I had people being like, yeah, you really don't want to go there. They're probably not going to do anything for you for, blah, blah, blah reasons, and I'm like, all right. But, I went anyway.
And to be fair, resources are basically always short for lots of these organizations, right? There are lots of homeless people, and so they sometimes have to be choosy about where those resources go.
But usually their choosiness is a little more like families, right? Like, okay, well, these people have children, so we'd like to help them out, right? And then there are a couple places that try to, do specific groups that don't normally have help, like LGBT groups, or, there's definitely women's shelters and stuff like that. And the thing about Salvation Army is that they say that they'll help everyone, but they only seem to help out veterans, which wouldn't be a problem if that's what they said that their thing was. But because their thing is supposed to be all homeless people, they just kind of do this thing where it's like, they just try kind of don't say it, right? Like, oh, we're just not going to say that the reason why we're not helping you is because, you're not a veteran. And, if that was the only problem, I wouldn't be making complaints, right? That's just kind of where this problem starts. The first interaction, I don't remember being negative, and maybe I just don't remember it well because I was, 20, 19, or somewhere between, 18 and 21, But I remember, the next time I went in there, my tattoos were visible. And if you see my tattoos, they're, two pentacles because I'm super into, Wiccan, pagan artistry, right? I just find it beautiful. So I like to have it on my body, right? And that time was interesting because I walk in and look for service. And this woman made sure she helped out everybody in there before me. And this included a guy who came in after me. And I know he came in after me. And then I saw him fill out the paperwork. And she tried to tell me that he, like, reserved, like, an appointment type thing. And I never heard of that, right? And there was another time where I called in to try and, like, make one of these appointments, right? And they're like, we don't do that. So she was just lying to me. And while I was sitting there, and, like, sometimes I try to, like, ask someone, like, oh, do you know, or, like, I try to, like, work with someone else, and it was just like they didn't want to work with me, and it was just, like, really weird. And I'm like, where am I? Because I was like, it was one of those moments where you wonder if you're, like, legit invisible, because it just seems like you're being ignored to that level, right? Like, I remember feeling like that and being like, am I crazy? Or, like, and it was when I saw that, like, this guy who I know came in after me, go up and get help, right? And then, I see all these people getting all these things, and then by the time I get up there, they're like, oh, we ran out of stuff.
And what were you there to look for?
I think I wanted a sleeping bag. I don't know if mine got stolen or if I just didn't have one, or because, like, why at that particular moment I didn't have a sleeping bag. But I had heard that the Salvation Army was giving out sleeping bags, and I watched the dude that came in behind me get a sleeping bag, right? And then when I went up there, they said they were out. And I was the last person in that building. And they definitely were trying to rush me out. And then when I tried to complain about it, like, some guys were like, well, it's for veterans, so, you just know that. Just know that's just for veterans. And I'm like, but they don't say that. They say that for everybody. It's like, yeah, well, they're just for veterans. I'm like, well, they should say it. And then, they try to say it's like I'm trying to cause a problem because, like, I don't want veterans to have help. I'm like, that's not it at all. But if you're going to say you're just for veterans, then just say it. So then the last time I went in there with my husband, and my husband's actually a veteran. And that's the first time I walked in there and ever got a clothing voucher. It was magical. I went in there married to a veteran, and suddenly I'm able to get a clothing voucher, but they gave it out grudgingly. They did not want to give those vouchers out. The one was giving us a stink face the whole time. It was crazy.
And so it seems at least part of the problem is just that there's no consistency. There's no real process. People are making shit up as they go along, and oftentimes how and who they help are motivated by politics and selective compassion for those who are part of certain groups. And even then, it lacks consistency. I also talked to Nell Gaither. She's the president of the Trans Pride Initiative, and they're mostly involved in advocacy surrounding incarcerated trans folks, but they do homeless advocacy as well. And she told me a story that illustrated the problems with this uncertainty pretty clearly.
The Salvation Army here in Dallas is probably the safest place that we can send a trans person to, even though we've had trouble with them in certain aspects before, because of the way the manager interprets the policy for the entire Southern District. Basically, it says that if you're sheltering somebody, you should shelter them safely. There's a line in the policy that says something about that. And she says that, well, you can't shelter a trans woman safely in the men's section. So she interprets that Southern policy as meaning that she will shelter trans women with the women's side. So that usually works in the emergency shelter, but where it doesn't, or where it at least didn't work in this case, was when the person tried to move from emergency shelter into transitional housing. And that's where we ran into a problem. Even though she had arranged with other people staying in the emergency shelter to move together into transitional housing where they would be sharing a room, the manager did not want to do that. And she basically said, well, you can't move into one of our shared rooms because you have to have what she was calling a full side.
The way the housing is arranged, there are 2 beds to a room, and 2 rooms share a bathroom. What they were saying is that for her to be housed there, she'd have to have one of those rooms to herself. This would mean using 2 beds for one person, which would obviously be an imposition on their program.
And when we started asking, well, why does she have to have a full side? Then it turned out that they were applying a genital rule, that they said because you've not had bottom surgery, you cannot share a room with a cisgender woman.
And for clarity's sake, they did actually literally use the phrase genital rule.
This person was really offended by that naturally, and she just walked out of the shelter, and we wound up getting her housing somewhere else. That triggered us also going to the city of Dallas to file a complaint under Chapter 46, which is the non-discrimination code in the city, and to pursue that as discrimination. We failed on that in a way because the city of Dallas determined that Salvation Army was a religious organization, and so they did not have jurisdiction under Chapter 46 to push a discrimination complaint.
And the thing to know is Salvation Army isn't just a charity. They're an actual Christian denomination. Their official organizing status for legal purposes is as a church. So this shielded them from being held responsible under Dallas's Chapter 46.
So the city of Dallas did, push Salvation Army to do better in the sense that they talked to them and said that this seemed to be discrimination under the Fair Housing Code, but they couldn't officially pursue the complaint because of the jurisdiction issue as a faith-based organization.
Another story that's often told around this time of year is the story of Jennifer Gale. The meme that's passed around the internet says that she died in the cold in Austin, Texas, after being refused shelter at the Salvation Army. I did some digging into the story, and it actually seems like it's a bit more complicated. There's apparently no evidence that she actively sought shelter at the Salvation Army that night, but I think we have to ask ourselves why in that case. Why would she choose to sleep outside in the cold instead of seeking shelter? It was well known to her at the time that being housed in a Salvation Army shelter would mean being housed with men. She'd have to use her legal name, and she'd have her personhood and identity just completely discarded. So what it seems happened is that she decided that sleeping on the steps of a church in 30-degree weather was a less bad option than being denied personhood at the only shelter in town that would take women. The medical examiner said that she died of cardiovascular disease, likely complicated by hypothermia and obesity. When folks have encounters with service providers and are turned away, or they're met with conditions that dehumanize them, they simply may not come back. And that's just as much of a problem, if not a bigger problem, than people outright denying service to people because they're trans. Here's Nell again.
We think that most of the people who are experiencing housing instability in the trans community are actually seeking out couch surfing opportunities, staying in vehicles, staying under the bridges, and just avoiding the shelter, because they know that shelters are not only places that they may be discriminated against, but if they do get in, they're subjected to violence at a higher rate than other people, than cisgender persons. We had another person seeking shelter. It was actually a couple who, it was a cisgender woman with a transgender man. And when they sought shelter, then the cisgender woman was told she could stay on the women's side, but because the trans man had not had bottom surgery, they said you can't stay on the men's side. But since he had a beard and was very masculine looking, they wouldn't let him stay on the women's side either, which he was willing to do. But so in this case, the couple refused to stay there because they couldn't both stay there, and they went back to, it was a threatening family situation that they were staying in that was not healthy. So they went back to that and continued to stay in that situation. And something else that's kind of another dynamic is, regardless of what the administrative policy is, that does not always filter down to the volunteer and to the desk staff and to the kind of interfacing people who are working with the people coming in and seeking shelter. So, for example, with the couple that I mentioned, they came in and they were refused shelter, but when I contacted the manager there, the manager said, well, that never should have happened. They should have been we should have found a place so that they didn't have to leave again. And we tried to get them to go back over there, but this couple did not want to go back and face possible discrimination or other issues there again. So they decided it was better to stay in their the family violence situation than to actually go back and try a shelter.
And so while we're certainly right to criticize and call out the Salvation Army, this problem is bigger than them. The Williams Institute estimates that 1 in 5 trans people have unstable housing or are at risk or in need of shelter services. It's estimated that 20 to 40% of homeless youth are members of the queer and trans community, and reports of bad treatment and discrimination are everywhere. This problem is so big. A lot of the organizations dedicated to helping the homeless are religious in nature and tend to lean conservative in their political views. Even organizations that want to help are chronically underfunded. Sort of feels like homeless advocates or paramedics administering first aid, but never able to get anyone to the hospital to get the actual problem fixed. I asked Nell to talk more broadly about how we address these problems at the root, and she said she wasn't sure of what actually constitutes addressing the root cause of the problem, but she did offer an example of an institutional change that was undertaken deliberately and did have some positive results.
There's an organization here that works with foster kids, and they had a bad reputation in the LGBTQ community, and they didn't realize it. When they started finding out about this bad reputation, they said, no, we don't discriminate. And then they started doing a survey or interviewing people, and they found out they did, and they found out how they did. So they implemented a 5-year program to work at changing their culture. And it was a very intentional and thorough way that started at the top and then intentionally worked its way down throughout the organizational structure. So that is kind of what's needed. It's changing the culture of how we see gender and gender acceptance. That's a lot of these places are not doing that. So what I can see, like at something like the Salvation Army, is you have the top level manager who understands the issues and may make kind of superficial statements that don't really percolate down, but at the other kind of end of the issue, you have young caseworkers coming in who also understand gender issues. And so some of them are coming in with a different perspective than, say, the volunteers and the front desk staff and things like that. Because in the training that we've done over at and some of our interactions with the Salvation Army here, there are case managers and some younger social workers and folks involved who do get it. And they're pushing from what they can, but then there's still that lack of whatever it would be, where it's the culture within the organization that's still not accepting it, because it's the status quo does not accept people's gender identity as they state it.
I'd love to leave you with a list of organizations you can donate to help out. But from my experience and talking to people who actually do this work, most of the organizations that do the best work are actually local grassroots organizations. So I'd encourage you to reach out to your local LGBTQ communities and see who's doing that work and ask how you might support. Dollars are good, time is good, anything helps. So if you're able, see what you can do. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Callie Gets It. The show is on Twitter at The Gaytheist Manifesto. You can shoot me an email at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com if you want to chat. I'd love to hear from you. I also want you to call me. Leave me a voicemail telling me about what you faced in 2018, what the obstacles were, and how you did or didn't overcome them. And I also want to hear about your hopes and fears for 2019. The phone number again, 513-878-0429. That's 513-878-0429. You'll hear a very pleasant sounding British lady tell you no one is available to take your call and to please leave a message. If you want to help me continue telling these stories, please share this episode around to your friends. We post them up on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and a quick share can go a long way to helping us grow. You can also check out patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto and consider a pledge to support the show. Any amount helps. Whether you're sharing, donating, talking about us with your friends, or reaching out privately to share your thoughts, triumphs, hopes, and fears, it all helps, and it all makes a difference. Before I go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things, and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is The Gaytheist Manifesto.